Hello, everyone. I'm Paris Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to 12 O'Clock High, a podcast on business leadership with Tom Fox, hosted by Richard Lummis.
What makes a great leader? Is it genetic, or can you learn leadership skills? Join Tom Fox and Richard Lummis in this podcast, where they consider leadership from a wide variety of perspectives: academic, behavioral science, history, popular culture, the movies, and much more. You'll learn about specific tactics and strategies that you can bring to your own leadership toolkit. 12 O'Clock High is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.
In this episode of 12 O'Clock High, a podcast on business leadership, we review an article in the Harvard Business Review by Grant Harris on how to brief senior leadership. We find lots of lessons for the compliance professional and business executive, and really anyone who needs to participate in a meeting.
Hello, this is Richard Lummis, and I'm here with Tom Fox for another episode of 12 O'Clock High, a podcast about leadership. In these discussions, we draw what we hope are interesting examples from our own experience, history, business, literature, and politics to examine what constitutes good leadership and extract lessons we can use to improve our own leadership skills. Welcome back, Tom.
Thank you, Richard.
Today, we're going to go back to our series on presidents with a discussion about Woodrow Wilson, our 28th president. I have to admit, I knew a little bit about aspects of his career, but researching for this podcast revealed several different facets of his personality and his times. It made me understand a little better why he seems to inspire such strong feelings, both pro and con, and why he's important today. Today, we'll discuss his career prior to assuming the presidency, and then we'll discuss his presidency and then his very brief post-presidential career. Thomas Woodrow Wilson was the son of a Presbyterian minister born in 1856 in Staunton, Virginia. Family moved to Augusta, Georgia shortly afterwards, and some of his earliest memories are therefore the Civil War and Reconstruction periods in the very deep South. Although his father had been born in Ohio, he was an ardent advocate for the Southern way of life and an apologist for slavery. He inculcated in young Woodrow a belief both in the righteousness of the Confederate cause and in the evils of the United States Constitution and its government. He was educated primarily by his father and a few tutors, and at 16 he entered Davidson College in North Carolina but dropped out after a year. He entered the College of New Jersey, which was subsequently renamed Princeton, in 1875 and graduated in 1879. He entered law school at the University of Virginia, but again dropped out after a year, this time probably as a result of a failed love affair with his first cousin. Very Southern Gothic of him. He continued to study law on his own, and in 1882 moved to Atlanta and passed the Georgia bar. And he practiced law for less than a year, but grew bored and entered Johns Hopkins University as a graduate student in history and political science, earning a PhD in 1886. Tom, I think his time in Baltimore is worth a slight digression because it reveals a lot about his political thought. Do you want to start talking about it?
So his John Hopkins experience I found particularly interesting. If I could maybe highlight something you brought up, which is his upbringing and indeed his father's views on race, on slavery, on the lost cause, and on Reconstruction. Indeed, Wilson would remark as an adult, the South was the only place in the world where nothing had to be explained to me. And I hadn't fully appreciated what that upbringing meant to him and how that influenced him. My digression, Richard, is I believe the 1944 movie adaptation of Wilson, which I saw as a youngster, and it heavily influenced me on my views of Wilson. I believe it won an Academy Award, but in as many movies, it was a great movie, but it wasn't really good history. And that's what I thought of for Woodrow Wilson for the longest time. And then researching for this podcast really drove home to me that view. His time at Johns Hopkins was critical, I think, to his development. He became a professor at Johns Hopkins, and his publication there of a book called Congressional Government really put him on the academic map. This book became a standard text in many ways, and I don't want to say it was revolutionary, but he argued for the replacing of the American separation of powers of between Congress and the presidency. It really didn't speak to the judiciary, with a British parliamentary system in which a prime minister would both lead the government and the majority in parliament. And as we move forward through his professional career as president of Princeton and governor of New Jersey into his presidency, it struck me how many of those characteristics that he wrote about he tried to put into place. And I was really surprised to see he really tried to rule. I shouldn't say rule. I should say run the country as its elected president in a much more parliamentary way as the prime minister. So I thought it was really interesting to look at that. But being put on the academic map in, I believe this was 1897, was equally important then as it is today. And academics matter. Good writing and good books matter, and they can really not only inform a debate, but can influence the author and the readers for many years to come. So I found that part really interesting. I just was not aware of his career at Johns Hopkins. And then he moved to Wesleyan. And I note this because, one, my roommate in law school went to Wesleyan, but he coached football at Wesleyan, and the other well-known football coach who came out of Wesleyan was Bill Belichick. So interesting data point there. And then he goes to Princeton, where he authors 2 more textbooks on government that became standard texts for literally the next 20 years, maybe even into the 1930s. He went to Princeton in 1902. As a professor, he went to Princeton a little bit earlier and later became the president of Princeton. But I found these times as formative for Wilson's political philosophy and indeed his political thought and leadership as any other time. And I don't know what your thoughts might be. I just was not aware of the Johns Hopkins period at all.
I wasn't either. And the other thing that came up that wasn't really mentioned in most of the descriptions of it was that he originally published Congressional Governments as a book. And then the faculty at Johns Hopkins later agreed to accept it as a dissertation. I had thought it was the other way around, that it was a dissertation that he subsequently published. But it actually went backwards that way. And I guess they gave him the PhD because it had been such a success. But I do think it shows his political thought and his distaste for the American system fairly clearly. When he was at Princeton, I mean, you mentioned he published several books on governance. He also published a biography of George Washington and a 5-volume history of the United States, which has been subsequently mined by people for the quotes about the virtues of the Ku Klux Klan and the correctness of the Southern view of slavery and secession. I've not read the entire 5 volumes, so I can't tell how out of context those quotes are, but they've certainly been used to tar his reputation in recent years.
He becomes president of Princeton. What did you find interesting or new for you in that phase of his career, Richard?
Well, I knew he had been president, but I wasn't aware quite how influential he was as president. The first probably 4 years, he became president, I think, in 1902, and the first 4 years were sort of a honeymoon period. He'd been hired to basically reform the university. It was sort of a Southern gentleman's club up to that point. And so he changed the academic system, made it considerably more rigorous. He introduced the preceptoral system where small groups of students meet with professors. But then he started running afoul of politics in the university. He wanted to create a large graduate school in the middle of the campus. He got his graduate school, but he didn't get it located where he was, and he made a lot of enemies in the process. But it was when he attempted to overturn the system of eating clubs, which are social clubs, which are invitation only, and residential housing that he alienated everybody. Students, alumni, faculty, trustees, they all disagreed with that. And so his remaining 5 or 6 years, you went to an Ivy League school, although basically
not at the same time. Wilson was at Princeton. Did you see remnants of any of that in your college experience, or was the design of Yale just completely different?
The design of Yale was completely different because it was completely revamped in the 30s into the residential college system. But my brother went to Princeton, and they still had eating clubs, and they were still the center of the social life. And they were very defined groups. One would be more Southern, one would be more intellectual. It's just it's interesting. It's not quite a fraternity system, but it's very similar.
The other thing about Princeton, and you touched on this, was in many ways the Southern Ivy League school. Even though it was located in New Jersey, a large number of Princeton graduates were officers for the Confederacy, and it maintained that Southern tradition probably up until today with the dining clubs, but certainly at the time Wilson was there. And I've often wondered what effect that had on him, as it was just, did it reinforce his vision of the South, a very hierarchical system with the elite sort of running things, or was it something different?
Well, I think he felt very at home because of the southernness of the environment. But I think you also started to see some characteristics of his personality that show up later, specifically in the various fights he had. He eventually decided that it was better to be defeated than to settle for a compromise. And we see that again and again in his later career. He seemed to seek out these quixotic causes that he could go down to glorious defeat in. And I think we do see some echoes of his father's training about the lost cause of the South in some of this.
One of the characteristics that I have found about Wilson in this study was, it seemed to me, particularly his last 5 years at Princeton, he became very prickly. And he took offense easily, and that offense could be if you disagreed with him and if you were against his position. And I think we saw that in his later years as governor of New Jersey, but we particularly saw that in the presidency. And I've been trying to think of an example, and I'd originally thought of perhaps Richard Nixon, but then I really rejected that. Obviously, Nixon had an enemies list and targeted people that he thought were against him, but I didn't think he was prickly, easy to offense. I think he would work with others, even if they disagreed with him. The example that came to mind for me was John Adams, and it was really based upon David McCullough's biography, where I really did get the sense that Adams was very prickly, very difficult to work with and for. Does that resonate with you, or do you have other perhaps examples that may resonate a little bit more for you as president?
Well, I think that Obama was quite a prickly personality, and Wilson, though, I think combined prickliness with pettiness and vindictiveness and spitefulness to a degree that Adams may be a better comparison. He kept grudges. He kept score. In fact, one of the quotes that I ran across from him was, "Tolerance is an admirable intellectual gift, but it is of little worth in politics." And I think that kind of summed up his approach. It was his way or the highway.
So, Richard, his next step was equally interesting. He becomes governor of New Jersey. Some of the readings we did indicated he was really a dark horse candidate, but one of the pieces said that he had always had his eye on politics, and that he viewed the academic career leading to the presidency of Princeton as a stepping stone. Although he believed he should be headed to the Senate. at this point in time, senators were elected by state legislators. That had not been changed by constitutional amendment. So it seemed to be a little bit of a dichotomy, but I think he was clearly a dark horse candidate to become the candidate for governor of New Jersey. He was nominated as a Democrat. There had been 4 consecutive Republican governors. New Jersey was viewed as, particularly the Democrats were viewed as very corrupt because of party bosses. I think that's also well known for New Jersey at that time as well. So he really tried to run on the outside. And there was a great quote, which I think is a little fastidious, but it said, quote, "It came to me unsought, ununanimously, and without pledges to anybody about anything." And I think he was trying to set himself apart. I'm not sure it came to him unsought, but that seemed to be the way that he garnered the nomination. And then he was elected. And he did engage in some significant reforms for the state of New Jersey. He had several pieces of legislation he was able to get through. And he turned his back on the party bosses, and even the party bosses who were very powerful, such as the then sitting U.S. Senator. So we saw a little bit, I think, of not only his leadership style, but a portending of some of the things he wanted to do as president when he was governor of New Jersey. What might have struck you about that time of his professional career?
Well, there are several references in his writings to the fact that he actually practiced law with a view of entering politics. So I think his eye was on politics pretty much all of his life. And this was his first chance to get into it. He was apparently looking for a graceful way out of Princeton at that point, since he'd suffered a series of defeats with both the faculty and the trustees. It turns out, of course, that his fight against the privileged Ivy League sold very well with the voters. So,
can we say it's still working?
I think so. So, but anyway, so the Democrats saw him as someone who was untainted by the boss system, but they also gravely miscalculated when they thought they could easily manipulate him. And I've been looking for it, but I couldn't ever find it again. But I remember reading a quote from him once that someone was saying, I don't really think you can handle the politics of being governor. And he said, "You've never been at a Princeton faculty meeting."
And he was absolutely correct.
He was absolutely correct. The old saying about the fights are so vicious because the stakes are so small. But anyway, so yeah, they gravely miscalculated, and he was able to leverage that into making some significant reforms in New Jersey, and then of course the Democrats sought him for the 1912 campaign.
So the 1912 campaign was, we've touched on this in prior podcasts about both Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, but it was one of the most fascinating campaigns in United States history. But once again, Wilson was a dark horse candidate. And one of the scenes that I still remember from the 1944 biography was when his supporters were able to coalesce and create a majority, and they had about an hour and a half or 2 hour parade on the floor of the convention, which is something they used to do to try to drum up support. And his campaign slogan was "The Pride of Princeton." And there was some validity in that. He truly was a dark horse candidate. I think it was the 15th or 20th ballot before he was able to begin to move up. But there were two key elements that put him in the nominee seat. The first was William Jennings Bryan, and one of the great characters of American history, nominated for presidency 3 times, became Wilson's Secretary of State. But Bryan threw his support to Wilson. The second thing was, I probably should have named this first, was Tammany Hall. And Tammany Hall backed one of Wilson's opponents, that's what caused Bryant, who announced he would not back anyone who Tammany Hall backed. So William Jennings Bryan threw his support to Wilson, and not being the Tammany Hall candidate indicated to many in the convention that he was not the party boss candidate. And that meant something at that point in time, because this, of course, was the high point of populism in the United States, or at least that phase of populism. So Wilson was able to garner that support and claim the mantle of populism, even with Teddy Roosevelt running in the Bull Moose Party.
Yeah, although it is worth noting that Wilson won with only 42% of the popular vote, as well as Roosevelt and Taft. Eugene Debs, the socialist, actually won 6% of the popular vote, which I think is indicative of how fragmented the country was at the time. We seem to think that our own times are unique in being fragmented and along very rigid lines, but it's really not anything particularly new.
There were two other things that I wanted to raise, Richard, about his campaign platform. He campaigned on something called the New Freedom Platform, and two of the major planks were busting up the trust, i.e. antitrust, and second was lowering of tariffs. Lowering of tariffs is not something we talk about much these days because, number one, our tax structure has changed with the advent of the personal income tax. But the more I thought about it, the past administration used tariffs much more aggressively, and the impact of tariffs and trade sanctions in 2020 or 2016 to 2020 impacted the American consumer. Well, the tariffs in 1912 impacted the American consumer. And so to your point, once again, we see there's really nothing new in American politics or American political debate. We may call it a little bit different. We certainly don't talk about lowering tariffs now, but the trade sanctions put in place by the now, as we're recording this, still current administration really increased the tariff prices essentially on many American consumers and American manufacturing companies. And we are now in a new phase of antitrust with the big tech companies. One action has been filed, and there may be others under the Biden administration, or there may be a change in the laws. So once again, we see that issue still.
And of course, the third part of the New Freedom Platform was the Federal Reserve System, which was created in 1913 in order to reform the banking system, which, again, remains a hot button issue with a fair number of people.
Richard, there's one thing that we have not discussed in this phase of Wilson's career that we both think is extraordinarily important as a leadership issue, and that's health. You want to talk a little bit about what happened to him, or what speculated to happen to him, and how that may presage certain things in his presidential term?
Well, it appears that he probably had a minor stroke while he was president of Princeton. He began to go, he'd always had weak eyesight, but he apparently began to go blind in one eye. The stroke may have changed his personality to make him even pricklier. I'm not convinced of that, but it certainly his health became a concern from there on out, and it may well have changed his personality somewhat. His Presbyterian faith was always very strong too, and with the Presbyterian belief in predestination, I think he was always inclined to be certain of his own rectitude, but I think that may have been an issue.
And that's something that, with age of our now incoming president
and our congressional leadership,
and our current president, I think a lot about that. And I hadn't thought about it really in terms of a leadership issue. Health is a leadership issue. I thought about it as sort of a new blood or different ideas or a path to leadership for some of the younger congressional representatives or those who might seek higher office, such as the presidency. But here it really drove home health. And, President Trump didn't want anyone to know about his health conditions. do we need to know? Do we have a right to know the health of our president? Should that be public knowledge? But here, it clearly was a critical issue, and I'm not sure I have an answer to that. But and if we take that to the boardroom, Steve Jobs would probably be the best example, still leading Apple while having stage 4 cancer. Was he still capable at that point? Do stakeholders or shareholders have the right to know about the physical health of leaders, their CEOs, their C-suite executives? Is that something that we need to take into account more? And has that even changed now in view of the coronavirus health crisis?
Well, I think it's always been a difficult balancing test. I feel the same about the financial disclosures, and they always try to balance that with extremely vague financial disclosures, and the health disclosures are a serious privacy issue. But at some point, I do think that they should be disclosed. We'll talk about this a lot more in the next podcast because it became very much an issue during his second term as president. And I think you're right. I think it's an issue today.
Richard, I really enjoyed particularly studying this phase of his career. I had studied his presidency and particularly the Treaty of Versailles and the 14 points in depth, but I hadn't really studied this part. There was, I have to say that the whole Southern upbringing and his original book were not things I was very aware of at all. And I think those really either shaped and formed his views literally for the rest of his life, or really were guideposts for him on how he governed going forward.
Well, I think they definitely were. And I think his admiration for a strong executive system, one of the articles we read said that by 1908, Wilson had become convinced that constitutional change was no longer necessary for a president to simply assume greater power. And he certainly showed that when he became president. But no, I found it very interesting. And I do think that we're going to see echoes of it throughout his career. Well, thank you for listening. And until next time, this is Richard Lummis and Tom Fox with 12 O'Clock High.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I hope you enjoyed this episode of 12 O'Clock High, a podcast on business leadership. Also, check out the article that the podcast is based upon in the show notes. Please join us again for our next episode where Richard Lummis and I will take another look at leadership. 12 O'Clock High, a podcast on business leadership, is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network and a proud member of C-Suite Radio.